For decades, scientists believed the story of human migration was simple. Early humans left Africa, spread across Asia and Europe, and eventually crossed into North America through a frozen land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska. It sounded logical, clean, and complete, but recent genetic discoveries are revealing a far more mysterious story. One that connects Indigenous Canadians with Aboriginal Australians through an ancient shared ancestry dating back tens of thousands of years. In a Canadian research laboratory, scientists began analyzing DNA samples collected from Indigenous communities across northern Canada. Their goal was to compare these genetic markers with ancient populations around the world. They tested the DNA against records from Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Polynesians, ancient Chinese civilizations, and many other early human societies. Advanced algorithms traced genetic relationships stretching back nearly 40,000 years. Then something unexpected appeared. The strongest ancient connection wasn't linked to nearby populations in Asia or the Americas. Instead, the data pointed toward Aboriginal Australians, one of the oldest continuous human populations on Earth. At first glance, the idea sounds impossible. Canada and Australia sit on opposite sides of the planet, separated by enormous oceans and thousands of miles. Scientists are not claiming that Aboriginal Australians somehow traveled directly to Canada in ancient times. The discovery is far deeper than that. What researchers are suggesting is that both groups may share ancestry from an incredibly ancient population that existed long before modern civilizations were born. A population so old that its descendants eventually spread across different parts of the world while still preserving traces of the same genetic signature. To understand this mystery, we need to travel back more than 60,000 years. At that time, the world looked very different. Sea levels were lower, coastlines stretched farther outward, and land bridges connected regions now divided by water. Somewhere in Africa, small groups of modern humans began leaving their homeland in search of survival. Scientists widely agree that all modern humans originated in Africa before spreading across the globe. For many years, researchers believed this migration followed a straightforward path. Humans moved into the Middle East, spread through Asia and Europe, and eventually crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. According to this theory, all indigenous peoples of the Americas descended from those migrants. But genetics started challenging that narrative. In 2015, a groundbreaking study published in the journal Nature shocked many anthropologists. Researchers studying indigenous populations in the Amazon rainforest discovered a strange genetic signal hidden within their DNA. Some Amazonian groups showed similarities not with East Asians, as expected, but with Aboriginal Australians and the Andaman Islanders, isolated indigenous people living in the Indian Ocean. Scientists called this mysterious ancestral source Population Y. No one fully understood how such a connection could exist. The signal was weak, but real. Researchers proposed that an ancient group of humans may have traveled along coastal routes through southern Asia thousands of years before the migrations previously believed to populate the Americas. For years, the evidence remained limited to parts of South America. Then, Canadian researchers expanded the search northward. By studying DNA from First Nations communities in Canada, scientists discovered similar genetic traces there as well. The connection repeatedly pointed toward the ancient genetic profile associated with Aboriginal Australians. This matters because Aboriginal Australians carry one of the oldest surviving genetic lineages on Earth. Their ancestors reached Australia somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago. Once sea levels rose, Australia became isolated, and these populations remained relatively separated from the rest of humanity for tens of thousands of years. Because of this isolation, Aboriginal Australian DNA preserved extremely ancient genetic information, almost like a living snapshot of early modern humans. Before large-scale mixing between populations changed the genetic landscape of the world, so when scientists found similar ancient signals within Indigenous Canadian populations, they realized they might be looking at evidence of one of humanity's earliest migrations. The biggest question became, how did this happen? One leading explanation is called the coastal migration theory. According to this idea, early humans leaving Africa traveled along the coastlines of southern Asia rather than moving only inland. During the Ice Age, lower sea levels exposed huge areas of land now underwater. Ancient people could move along these coastal pathways using primitive boats or by crossing narrow stretches of water. One branch of this population eventually reached Australia, becoming the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians. Another branch may have continued north along Asia's coastline, eventually reaching Siberia and crossing into the Americas long before later migration waves arrived. The problem is that most evidence of this journey may now lie beneath the ocean. Rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age submerged ancient campsites, settlements, and migration routes. Archaeologists cannot easily recover what has been lost underwater. That is why genetics has become so important. When physical traces disappear, DNA becomes the historical record. The Canadian study did not begin with the intention of making sensational claims. Researchers simply followed the data. Again and again, the same ancient signal appeared. They checked for contamination, reran analyses, and compared additional populations. The connection continued to hold. If confirmed through future research, the implications are enormous. It would mean the settlement of the Americas was far more complicated than scientists once believed. Instead of a single migration event, there may have been multiple waves of humans entering the continent from different ancestral populations over tens of thousands of years. It would also mean that Indigenous Canadians and Aboriginal Australians share a link reaching back to one of the earliest chapters in human existence. But the story is not only scientific, it also touches culture, memory, and identity. Indigenous oral traditions have preserved history for thousands of years. Aboriginal Australian songlines contain navigational knowledge, ecological information, and ancestral memory passed through generations. Some First Nations oral histories in Canada describe flooding events believed to correspond with the end of the Ice Age more than 10,000 years ago. Could fragments of these ancient migrations survive in cultural memory? No one can say for certain. Scientists remain careful not to make assumptions about traditions they do not fully understand. But the possibility itself is remarkable. Modern genetic research has transformed our understanding of prehistory. Over the past 15 years, advances in DNA sequencing have shown that human history was never simple. Ancient populations mixed, migrated, disappeared, and reappeared in ways scientists never expected. Human migration was not a straight line. It was a web of movements, interactions, and survival stories unfolding over thousands of generations. The Canadian findings fit into this growing picture of complexity. They do not completely rewrite human history, but they add another layer to it. A layer suggesting that some of the deepest human connections on Earth still survive inside living people today. Think about what that truly means. 50,000 years ago, there were no cities, no written language, no empires, and no recorded history. Human beings lived entirely through survival, movement, and adaptation. Yet despite all the ice ages, rising seas, wars, and civilizations that followed, fragments of those ancient ancestors still exist within our DNA. The people carrying these genetic echoes had no idea they would become part of such an extraordinary story. Yet their descendants now live on opposite sides of the world, connected by invisible biological threads stretching across unimaginable spans of time. What makes this discovery even more important is the ethical discussion surrounding it. For much of history, indigenous communities were exploited by scientific institutions. Biological samples were often collected without proper consent, and indigenous peoples had little control over how their ancestry was studied or interpreted. Today, many communities demand a stronger voice in genetic research involving their people. Some indigenous scholars argue that Western science should not define identity solely through DNA. Others believe genetics can help validate ancient histories and strengthen recognition of indigenous heritage. These debates are ongoing and deeply important. The science cannot be separated from the people whose lives and histories are connected to it. Still, the genetic signal itself remains difficult to ignore. Somewhere in the distant past, an ancient population existed before modern civilizations emerged. Their descendants eventually spread across vast regions of the world. One branch became the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians. Another contributed to indigenous populations in the Americas, including communities in Canada. For tens of thousands of years, those connections remained hidden. Only now, through modern technology, are scientists beginning to uncover them. Researchers continue collecting new data from ancient remains and living populations across the globe. Every new genome adds another piece to the puzzle. Some findings support the theory, while others challenge parts of it. That is how science works, slowly building understanding through evidence, debate, and repeated testing. But one thing has become increasingly clear. Human history is older, stranger, and more interconnected than we ever imagined. The DNA preserved within Indigenous Canadians and Aboriginal Australians may represent one of the oldest surviving records of humanity's first great journey across Earth. Not a myth, not a legend, but a biological memory carried silently through thousands of generations. And perhaps the most astonishing part of all is this: the evidence was inside human beings the entire time. Science simply learned how to read it.